All right, let's go over schizophrenia now. So, I thought it might be a nice break for you to get your information from something more dynamic than just PowerPoints with me talking. So, I came up with a couple of videos and I spliced them together. And the reason why I chose these two videos is one, I think the first one he does a great job, but I do need to say that although I love that guy, he makes my head spin with how quickly he talks. So I think you're going to have to stop and start this video many times in order to answer these questions. Then in the first video, he alludes to something about the immune system. And I felt like I wanted more information about that. And so I found another video that I took a little clip of to kind of go over that a little bit more that will add to it. So after you watch this videos and fill out these objectives from the videos, your next module is gonna be a simulation of schizophrenia. So you might be able to feel what it would feel like to be schizophrenic. So I made this onto a downloadable version that you can download and print to take notes as you're watching the video, and it's located in the module just above this one.
Rare, affecting about 1% of the population, schizophrenia causes more anxiety in the media, in the public, and even in doctors' offices than any other mental illness. As a result, its sufferers have often been shunned, abused, or locked up. And among the many fallacies that surround the disorder is simply what it means. The word schizophrenia literally means split mind, but contrary to popular belief, the condition has nothing to do with a split in personality or multiple personalities. The term refers instead to what's sometimes called a split from reality. Multiple personality disorder, now known as dissociative identity disorder, is a totally different type of condition, a kind of dissociative disorder. And these two are shrouded in misconceptions, partly because they were the subject of probably the greatest psychological hoax of all time. While many of us can relate on some level to the emotional swings, nervousness, and compulsions that come with mood and anxiety disorders, it can be a lot harder for those without direct experience to relate to the symptoms of schizophrenia and dissociation. Unfortunately, we tend to fear and avoid what we don't understand in each other, whether it's a friend or family member or just some stranger on the bus. But thankfully, part of the psychologist's job is to demystify the things that can happen in our heads, and as is often the case, understanding may be the key to compassion. Schizophrenia is a chronic condition that usually surfaces for men in their early to mid-20s and for women in their late 20s. For some, the disorder comes on gradually, but for others it can arise more suddenly, perhaps triggered by stress or trauma, although no event can actually cause the disorder. Once thought of as a single discrete condition, schizophrenia is now included in the DSM-5 as a point on a spectrum of disorders that vary in how they're expressed and how long they last, but they share similar symptoms. Schizophrenia spectrum disorders are currently thought of as characterized by disorganized thinking, emotions and behaviors that are often incongruent with their situations, and disturbed perceptions, including delusions and hallucinations. They all involve a kind of loss of contact with reality on some level. The resulting behaviors and mental states associated with this break from reality are generally called psychotic symptoms, and they usually impair the ability to function. When someone's experiencing psychotic symptoms, their thinking and speech can become disorganized, rambling, and fragmented. This tendency to pick up one train of thought and suddenly switch to another and then another can make communication painfully difficult. People exhibiting these symptoms can also suffer a breakdown in selective attention, losing the ability to focus on one thing while filtering others out. In extreme cases, speech may become so fragmented it becomes little more than a string of meaningless words, a condition given a name that sounds like its own kind of non sequitur, word salad. Classic schizophrenia is also often marked by delusions or false beliefs not based in reality. These delusions can be rooted in ideas of grandeur, like I'm the Queen of England, or I won an Olympic gold medal for the luge. Or they can become narratives of persecution and paranoia, believing your thoughts and actions are being controlled by an outside force, or that you're being spied on or followed, or that you're on the verge of a major catastrophe. And there are some complicated variations on these delusions, like feeling that you've died or don't exist anymore, or that someone is madly in love with you, or that you're infested with parasites. Delusions of one kind or another strike as many as 4 out of 5 people with schizophrenia. While some delusions can seem fairly logical, they can also be severe and bizarre and frightening. Unfortunately, many of the most memorable examples of people suffering from severe delusions come from serial killers, and yeah, while Son of Sam did claim that he was taking orders from his neighbor's dog, that kind of stuff is in the tiny minority. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys and Syd Barrett of Pink Floyd have both suffered psychotic symptoms. And then, of course, there's John Nash, the Nobel Prize-winning American mathematician and subject of the movie A Beautiful Mind. Through proper treatment, some people with schizophrenia have not only learned to live with their illness, but also made fantastic creative contributions to the world. Many people with schizophrenia also suffer from perceptual disturbances or sensory experiences that come without any apparent sensory stimulation, like hallucinations. This is when a person sees or hears something that isn't there, often lacking the ability to understand what is real and what isn't. Auditory hallucinations or hearing voices are the most common form, and these voices are often abusive. It's as if your inner monologue, that little conversation that you have with yourself, or the random things that float through your head, were somehow coming from outside of you. It's as if you couldn't sort out whether the voices in your mind were internal and self-generated or external and other-generated. To me, it sounds terrifying. Other common symptoms include disorganized, abnormal, or incongruent behavior and emotions. This could mean laughing when recalling a loved one's death, or crying while others are laughing, acting like a goofy child one minute then becoming unpredictably angry or agitated the next. Movements may become inappropriate and compulsive, like continually rocking back and forth or remaining motionless for hours. Broadly, most psychotic symptoms fall into three general categories traditionally used by psychologists: positive, negative, and disorganized symptoms. Positive symptoms are not what they sound like. They're the type that add something to the experience of the patient, like, for example, hallucinations or inappropriate laughter or tears or delusional thoughts. Negative symptoms refer to those that subtract from normal behavior, like a reduced ability to function, neglect of personal hygiene, lack of emotion, toneless voice, expressionless face, or withdrawal from family and friends. Finally, disorganized symptoms are those jumbles of thought or speech that could include word salad and other problems with attention and organization. Symptoms like these are useful in diagnosing a disorder on the schizophrenia spectrum, but there's a physiological component too. Like many of the disorders we've talked about, schizophrenia has been associated with a number of brain abnormalities. Postmortem research on schizophrenia patients has found that many have extra receptors for dopamine, a neurotransmitter involved in emotion regulation and the brain's pleasure and reward centers. Some researchers think that overly responsive dopamine systems might magnify brain activity in some way, perhaps creating hallucinations and other so-called positive symptoms as the brain loses its capacity to tell the difference between internal and external stimuli. For this reason, dopamine-blocking drugs are often used as antipsychotic medications in treatment. Modern neuroimaging studies also show that some people with schizophrenia have abnormal brain activity in several different parts of the brain. One study noted that when patients were hallucinating, for example, there was unusually high activity in the thalamus, which is involved in filtering incoming sensory signals. Another study noted that patients with paranoid symptoms showed overactivity in the fear-processing amygdala. So schizophrenia seems to involve not just problems with one part of the brain, but abnormalities in several areas and their interconnections. But what might be causing these abnormalities? Earlier I mentioned how a stressful event might trigger psychotic symptoms for the first time, even though it can't actually create the disorder. Psychologists call this the DIATHESIS-STRESS model. This way of thinking involves a combination of biological and genetic vulnerabilities, diathesis, and environmental stressors, stress, that both contribute to the onset of schizophrenia. This model helps explain why some people with genetic vulnerability might not always develop schizophrenia, and why the rates of schizophrenia tend to be higher with some degree of poverty or socioeconomic stress. And it seems clear that there is some kind of genetic predisposition for the disorder. The 1 in 100 odds of developing schizophrenia jump to nearly 1 in 10 if you have a parent or sibling with the disorder, with about 50-50 odds if that sibling is an identical twin, even if those twins were raised apart. One recent landmark 7-year study looked at genetic samples across 35 countries, examining more than 35,000 people with schizophrenia and another 110,000 people without the disorder. The study identified more than 100 genes that may increase the risk of schizophrenia. As expected, some of these genes involve dopamine regulation, but others are related to immune system functioning. Researchers continue to tease out what is exactly going on here, but many are hopeful that these new findings will lead to better treatment. Clearly, schizophrenia is a challenging disorder to live with and one that's hard for outsiders to understand, but maybe even more
to To be clear, schizophrenia is not the same thing as having multiple personality disorder. Symptoms often include hallucinations, from seeing things that aren't there, to delusions such as a higher belief in conspiracy, higher rates of depression, and most notably, hearing voices. Auditory hallucinations occur in many disorders, from simple sounds to words or names being called, but the voices heard in schizophrenics are quite different. They're often associated with their current mental state and can be quite hostile, accusing, threatening, or persecuting, ultimately embodying many of their fears. A 2006 study of over 3,000 schizophrenic patients found that genes related to immune function may play a role, specifically the complement component 4 or C4 genes. C4 is a gene involved in trimming the synapses in the brain. For example, teenage brains undergo a process known as synaptic pruning, in which unused connections are cut away to aid in our brain's efficiency. But in individuals with schizophrenia, the C4 gene may be overactive and cut down areas that are involved in planning, cognition, and thinking. Links have also been made between microbes in the gut. After all, the microbes that live within us have also been shown to modulate immune response and impact brain development. One study found that lactic acid bacteria were significantly more abundant in people with schizophrenia, while another found that the prevalence of lipid and glucose abnormalities is much higher in patients with schizophrenia. And while diagnosing schizophrenia is primarily based on behavior and reported experiences, research has found the cause to be a combination of these genetic factors along with some environmental stressors like growing up in an urbanized area, minority group position, and even cannabis use, as THC can exaggerate psychotic response in some individuals with genetic risk or developmental trauma. Currently, medication for schizophrenia mostly focuses on combating hallucinations and delusions, but unfortunately, 49.5% of schizophrenia patients don't end up taking their medicine. This is why genetic research is so important to combating this disease. Of course, some people can and do recover through a combination of medication, counseling, and support, which can greatly reduce the symptoms. On ASAP Thoughts,